Her violin shrieked, a raw cry of despair in Monte Carlo's casino. Ruined and hunted, Alara had nowhere. But from his dark alcove, the city's most dangerous man watched, his steel gaze promising terrifying salvation. He didn't just see her shame, he claimed her. When her past attacked, this mafia king obliterated threats, binding her as his prize. Safe in his gilded cage, was she truly free? Or had she traded one hell for an intoxicating, inescapable paradise? The chandeliers of the Golden Serpent Casino glittered like frozen starlight, each crystal refracting the opulent glow across the marble floors and polished mahogany. A symphony of high-stakes gambling, the rhythmic click of roulette wheels, the crisp rustle of high-denomination notes, the hushed murmur of excited voices, provided a relentless backdrop to Alara Vance's performance. Every night, the rich and the ruthless descended upon Monte Carlo's crown jewel, oblivious to the desperate plea woven into the classical melodies emanating from the lounge's small, elevated stage. Alara's fingers, slender and imbued with a lifetime of dedication, danced across the strings of her antique guarneri. The violin, a family heirloom, felt like a living extension of her soul, its aged wood vibrating against her chin, constant, comforting weight. Tonight, however, the familiar warmth was tinged with a devastating chill. Each exquisite note of Brahms' violin concerto in D major felt less like an offering to art and more like a desperate, protracted prayer. Prayer that was going unanswered. 3 years. 3 agonizing years since Julian Thorne, her charismatic, charming, utterly manipulative ex-husband, had vanished into the ether, leaving behind a crater of debt that had swallowed her entire existence. He hadn't just gambled away their modest savings. He'd forged her signature, taken out loans in her name, and then, with a callous disregard for the wreckage he'd created, disappeared. The creditors, initially faceless, had morphed into the terrifying flesh-and-blood enforcers of Silas. Silas. The name itself felt like a viper's hiss, synonymous with the darkest corners of Monte Carlo's underworld, a shadowy loan shark whose generosity came with an unspeakably brutal price. The scent of expensive cigars mingled with rare perfumes, Hermes, Chanel, Creed, a suffocating olfactory tapestry of wealth she could never attain, only serve. Her gaze drifted over the immaculately dressed patrons, their faces flushed with either champagne or greed. None of them, she knew, would ever truly see her. To them, she was merely part of the ambience, a sophisticated backdrop to their decadent lives. This invisibility, once a shield, now felt like a curse. It meant no one would notice her quiet descent into despair. No one would hear the silent screams behind her soaring melodies. A particularly resonant passage swelled, drawing a scattering of polite applause. Alara offered a practiced, brittle smile, her heart a frantic hummingbird trapped in her ribs. The applause felt like tiny pinpricks on her already raw nerves. Tonight was the night. The final deadline. Silas had made that abundantly clear in the cryptic, chilling message left on her cheap flip phone this morning. Tick-tock, little bird. The cage is closing. Pay or play. Play for Silas meant something far more sinister than performing Tchaikovsky. It meant compromising her integrity, her art, her very being. The thought sent a tremor through her bow arm, almost marring a delicate vibrato. She forced herself to regain control, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Her violin. Her beautiful, irreplaceable guarneri. Silas knew its value, both monetary and sentimental. He had hinted in prior, increasingly violent communications that if she couldn't pay, her most prized possession would suffer. The mental image of him, or one of his brutish men, snapping the neck of her instrument, its wood splintering, strings screaming in agony, was a nightmare that haunted her waking hours. It was a threat far more potent than any physical harm he could inflict upon her own body. After her set, the applause faded quickly, replaced by the persistent, glamorous cacophony of the casino. Alara retreated to the cramped, dusty dressing room, the stark contrast to the opulence outside almost mocking. The air here was stale, heavy with the ghosts of forgotten performers and cheap hairspray. She carefully placed her violin in its velvet-lined case, her fingers tracing the smooth, familiar curves. This instrument wasn't just a tool. It was her lineage, her identity, the last tangible link to a life before Julian's devastating betrayal. Without it, she would truly be lost. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over Julian's long-dead contact. Useless. He was a phantom, a memory that tasted of ash. She scrolled through her contacts, a pathetic list of names who either couldn't or wouldn't help. Friends from conservatory, now thriving in orchestras across Europe, would only offer platitudes and pity. Lawyers had shaken their heads, citing the complexities of offshore debts and Julian's masterful disappearance act. There is no one. Absolutely no one. The loneliness was a physical ache, a gaping wound in her chest. She was trapped, suffocating under the weight of a debt that wasn't hers, facing a monster whose cruelty knew no bounds. Every avenue was blocked. Every door slammed shut. The golden facade of Monte Carlo felt less like a dream and more like a gilded prison. A notification popped up, jolting her. Not a call, but a message from an unknown number. Her breath hitched. Her fingers, usually so nimble, fumbled as she opened it. Last chance. Midnight. Lobby. Don't disappoint. Silas. Midnight. Just 2 hours away. Her heart hammered, a frantic drum against her ribs. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a summons. A final judgment. The walls of her small dressing room seemed to close in, the air growing thin, heavy with the scent of her own rising fear. She was at the precipice, staring into the abyss with no net, no parachute, and no one to catch her fall. But as she clutched her violin case, a desperate thought flickered, a tiny ember in the overwhelming darkness. Perhaps, just perhaps, tonight's performance wasn't quite over. Perhaps there was one more card to play, one last terrifying note to strike. Even if it meant playing directly into the hands of the most dangerous man in Monte Carlo. The man whose piercing gaze she had felt from across the lounge. The man they called Damon Volkov. The stage lights, usually a warm embrace, now felt like searing spotlights, intensifying the oppressive heat that gathered around Alara. The Golden Serpent's lounge was a humid jungle of desire and desperation, even at this late hour. Tonight, the air itself seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension, an energy that hummed beneath the rich strains of Tchaikovsky's violin concerto. Alara poured every ounce of her beleaguered soul into the music, her bow a frantic blur across the strings, coaxing out melodies that were supposed to soar, but in her heart felt weighed down by lead. Her mind, however, was a battleground. Silas's text message, the chilling pronouncement of midnight. Lobby. Don't disappoint, echoed louder than the orchestra. Each note she played was a desperate attempt to drown out the insidious whispers of panic, the vivid images of her Guarneri, splintered and useless. Her fingers, usually so precise, felt heavy, almost clumsy, as if the weight of her impending doom was transferring directly through the ancient wood of her instrument. A bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, tickling her jawline, a tiny personal torment amidst the grand performance. She tried to lose herself, as she always did, in the intricate cadenzas, the soaring emotional arcs of the concerto. But the faces in the crowd blurred into a sea of indifferent eyes, and the opulent decor of the casino, usually a source of detached wonder, now felt like a gilded cage, its bars pressing in on her. The perfume of the woman in the front row, a cloying gardenia, mixed with the sharp scent of whiskey and stale cigarette smoke, assaulting her senses. Her bow was nearing the most challenging passage of the first movement, a flurry of rapid notes demanding absolute precision and unwavering focus. This was her sanctuary, her escape, the one place where she still felt truly herself. Yet, even here, Julian's betrayal and Silas's malice had found her. A sudden jarring image of Silas's sneering face, superimposed over the sheet music, flashed in her mind. Her breath hitched. Her foot slipped slightly on the polished floor. And then it happened. Her bow, for the first time in her professional career, veered off course. A hideous, ear-splitting screech tore through the elegant lounge, a sound so discordant, so utterly out of place, that it felt like a physical wound. The music died abruptly, brutally, leaving behind a vacuum of stunned silence. Every eye in the lounge, once glazed with indifference, now swiveled towards her, their gazes like 100 tiny daggers. Alara froze, her violin still pressed to her chin, her bow hovering in the air. Her cheeks flamed crimson, a blush that burned from the roots of her hair to the tips of her toes. Shame, hot and devastating, washed over her, an inferno consuming her composure. This wasn't just a mistake. It was an amputation of her dignity, a public execution of her last remaining pride. Her fingers trembled so violently she feared she might drop the guarneri. The shame was suffocating, threatening to choke off her breath entirely. Then, through the blur of her mortification, her eyes were drawn to a single table, nestled in a secluded alcove near the back. It was his table, the one always reserved for the owner, Damon Volkov. She hadn't seen him enter, but he was there now, a dark, imposing figure, his presence a silent earthquake. He sat utterly still, a study in controlled power, like a predator patiently observing its prey. His tailored suit, a fabric so dark it seemed to absorb the light, accentuated the stark angles of his face. She couldn't discern the color of his eyes from this distance, but she felt their intensity, a cold, assessing gaze that sliced through the shimmering chaos of her humiliation. He didn't smirk, didn't recoil, didn't even betray a flicker of overt judgment. His expression was utterly unreadable, a stone mask that nevertheless radiated an undeniable, dangerous authority. It was the gaze of a man who saw everything, missed nothing, and judged with a finality that made her blood run cold. Was he furious? Amused? Or simply evaluating her as he would a faulty blackjack dealer or a malfunctioning slot machine? The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the mistake itself. A minute stretched into an eternity. The murmurs in the lounge slowly began to resume, a low, buzzing hum of whispers and speculation, a stark contrast to the deafening silence that had followed her blunder. Alara wanted to flee, to vanish into the glittering backdrop, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, encased in lead. Then a subtle movement. Volkov's hand, large and immaculately manicured, lifted a fraction. Not a wave, not a beckon, but a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture towards the orchestra leader. The leader, a man usually brimming with theatrical flair, stiffened, his eyes darting to Volkov's table, then back to Alara with a fleeting, panicked glance. Within seconds, a sleek, impeccably dressed waiter, whose movements were as silent as a ghost, materialized at the edge of the stage. He held aloft a chilled bottle of champagne, its label glinting under the lights, a rare vintage, something she knew she could never afford in a lifetime of honest work. The waiter approached her, his face a mask of polite deference. "Miss Vance," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the din of her anxiety. "Mr. Volkov requests you accept this. And to please compose yourself." The words, though polite, were a direct order, an implicit command from the man who owned this glittering empire. Alara's cheeks flushed again, this time with a mixture of embarrassment and a dawning, bewildering understanding. He wasn't just offering champagne, he was offering a bomb to her public wound, a display of his absolute power to control the narrative, even over her own catastrophic mistake. It was a gesture that said, "I saw your vulnerability, and I choose to acknowledge it, to address it." But what did he want in return? Her hand, still trembling, reached out mechanically, accepting the glass the waiter poured. The cool touch of the crystal against her skin was a small anchor in the storm. She lifted it, her eyes drawn back inevitably to Volkov's table. His gaze was still fixed on her, unwavering. This time she thought she detected a subtle flicker, a spark of something she couldn't quite name, not kindness, not pity, but perhaps a dangerous blend of intrigue and proprietorship. A strange, dizzying sensation washed over her. Fear, yes, a primal, bone-deep fear of this man and the world he commanded. But beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of something else began to sprout. Hope. A dangerous, treacherous hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this serpent's gaze, this silent, powerful offer, was not a prelude to further humiliation, but a terrifying, beautiful lifeline. Even if accepting, it meant stepping into a cage gilded with gold, rather than one of cold iron. The clock ticked towards midnight, and Alara knew with a chilling certainty that her meeting in the lobby with Silas was now entirely beside the point. Damon Volkov had just made his move, and she was already caught in his web. The formal summons arrived with the morning sun, slipping under her door like a silken snake. It was a crisp, heavy card, embossed with the unmistakable, intricate logo of the golden serpent, a coiled serpent, jewel-eyed, holding a stylized lyre. Inside, a single line of elegant calligraphy. Mr. Volkov requests your presence for a private performance this evening, 8 p.m. Penthouse suite. No polite RSVP. No option to decline. It was an edict. Alara's breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Fear, sharp and crystalline, pierced through her lingering shame from the previous night. She had felt his gaze, accepted his champagne, and now the inevitable consequence. He was not a man who offered unsolicited kindness without expectation. This was not an invitation, it was a prelude. Her fingers, usually so steady, trembled as she dropped the card onto her worn kitchen counter. The cheap formica felt incongruous beneath such opulence. All day, the thought of the impending meeting gnawed at her. Her small apartment, usually a haven of quiet solitude, now felt like a cage growing steadily smaller. The scent of stale coffee and fear clung to the air. She paced, rehearsing arguments, pleas, desperate attempts to assert some shred of autonomy. But each imaginary scenario ended the same way, with Damon Volkov's unreadable face and her own utter powerlessness. What could she possibly offer him? Her music? He owned the casino where she played. Her body? The thought sent a jolt of revulsion through her, yet a sickening part of her acknowledged the terrifying possibility. As dusk settled, painting the Monte Carlo sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, Alara dressed. She chose her most conservative black dress, a simple sheath that clung to her curves without being overtly provocative. It was a futile attempt to regain control, to present herself as a professional, an artist, not a desperate woman on the brink. Her violin, its polished surface reflecting the last sliver of daylight, seemed to whisper warnings from its case. The driver, a hulking man in a pristine black suit, arrived exactly at 7:45 p.m. His silence was as unnerving as Volkov's. The ascent to the penthouse was swift, the elevator gliding upward with a hushed efficiency that spoke of immense wealth. Each floor passed felt like another layer of her old life peeling away, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. The penthouse itself was a revelation of decadent power. Not overtly flashy, but breathtakingly grand. High ceilings soared, adorned with subtle frescoes. The air, cool and faintly scented with sandalwood and expensive leather, felt strangely heavy, charged with an unspoken authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic vista of the glittering city and the dark, restless expanse of the Mediterranean. It was beautiful, devastatingly so, and profoundly oppressive. This was not a home. It was a fortress, a command center. Damon Volkov stood by the window, silhouette against the city lights. He turned as she entered, his movements fluid, predator-like. His eyes, now visible in the soft, ambient lighting, were the color of cold steel, sharp and unwavering. A tremor ran through Alara. He was even more imposing up close, his presence a physical force that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Miss Vance, his voice was a low, resonant rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Thank you for coming. It wasn't a thank you. It was an acknowledgement of her obedience. He gestured to a space cleared for her violin, a plush Persian rug spread before a grand piano. She moved mechanically, setting up her instrument, her hands surprisingly steady. The music began, a piece chosen not for passion, but for technical brilliance, Bach Chaconne. She poured everything into it, the intricate harmonies, the demanding variations. It was her defiance, her last stand, a declaration that even if her life was in ruins, her art remained. Damon didn't move from the window. He simply watched, his gaze dissecting her, studying every nuance of her performance. He didn't applaud when she finished. The silence that followed was agonizing, stretching taut like an overwound string. "You play with fire, Miss Vance," he finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And with despair." Alara's jaw tightened. "I play with what I have, Mr. Volkov." He walked towards her then, his steps deliberate, unhurried, yet somehow closing the distance with alarming speed. The scent of him, sharp, clean, dangerous, filled her nostrils. "Your passion is evident. Your technique flawless. But your soul, it is fractured." He stopped mere feet from her, his height towering, his shadow falling over her. "Tell me, Alara," he used her first name, a quiet claim that sent a shiver down her spine. "Why does a woman of your talent find herself trapped in such a web?" His questions were not idle chatter. They were precise, incisive, cutting through her practiced defenses. He asked about Julian, about the debts, about her dreams, about the Guarneri. Each answer felt like bearing a piece of her soul to a surgeon holding a scalpel. She spoke, her voice surprisingly steady, fueled by a strange mix of fear and a desperate need to be truly seen, truly heard for once. Just as she recounted the escalating threats from Silas, her phone, buzzing silently in her handbag, demanded her attention. She excused herself, moving to a small, ornate table, her heart pounding. It was another unknown number. The message was succinct, brutal. "Your precious violin string. Hope you have more. Midnight tomorrow. Warehouse 13. Or else." A picture was attached. A single, gut-wrenching image of a severed violin string, lying on the doorstep of her apartment building. Her breath caught in her throat. He had been there. He knew where she lived. The violation was sickening. Silas wasn't playing anymore. This was a direct, chilling promise to destroy the last piece of her. When she turned back, Damon was watching her, his steel gaze sharper than before. He had heard the small gasp, seen the sudden pallor of her face. "Trouble, Alara?" His voice was a low growl, laced with an unsettling knowing. She clutched her phone, her knuckles white. "Silas," she whispered, the name a bitter taste on her tongue. He's escalating." Damon simply nodded, his face a mask of cold comprehension. He walked back to the window, his back to her, and the silence stretched once more, pregnant with unspoken power. Then he turned. "I will pay your debts," he stated, his voice flat, definitive. "All of them. To Silas, to anyone Julian entangled you with. You will be free of him. Free of all of it." Alara stared, hope and terror warring within her. "Why," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" His eyes, when they met hers, held a chilling possessiveness that made her skin prickle. Your talent. Your presence. You will live here, under my protection. You will continue to play your music, for me, for my guests. You will be my asset, my possession. My muse." His words were delivered with a calm, unyielding authority, like a king decreeing a sentence. "You will be safe, wanted for nothing. But you will be mine." The golden chains. She saw them then, not forged of iron, but of silk and undeniable power. He wasn't offering salvation. He was offering a gilded cage, a different kind of servitude. The thought was repugnant, a violation of her spirit. To be owned, after fighting so hard for independence, even a flawed one. Yet, as she looked at the city lights twinkling below, the distant, merciless sparkle of the Mediterranean, she knew. Silas. Julian. The endless, suffocating dead. There was no escape. This terrifying, dangerous man, this mafia boss, was her only way out. Her only chance to save her violin, her life, her very self from utter annihilation. Her spirit screamed in protest, but her pragmatism, honed by years of struggle, asserted its brutal logic. Her voice was a mere whisper, laced with a resentment she couldn't entirely mask. "Deal." Damon's lips curved, a slow, predatory smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He raised a hand, and within seconds, a man appeared from seemingly nowhere, holding a pen and a single, crisp document. A contract. "Welcome to your new life, Valera Vance," Damon Volkov said, his voice a possessive purr, as she looked at the blank line waiting for her signature, realizing she had just traded one prison for another, far more opulent and infinitely more dangerous. The ink on the page seemed to shimmer with an unspoken promise of both protection and absolute ownership. The penthouse, once a magnificent spectacle from the night she'd signed her soul away, now felt like a gilded mausoleum. Alara moved through its vast, opulent rooms like a ghost, her footsteps echoing faintly on the polished marble and rich, deep-pile carpets. Every surface gleamed, every piece of art spoke of immense wealth and impeccable taste, yet the air remained thin, suffocatingly silent. It wasn't a home. It was a museum of luxury she was now condemned to inhabit, a rare, caged exhibit. Her meager belongings, a single suitcase of clothes and a handful of worn sheet music, seemed absurdly out of place in the sprawling master suite Damon had designated for her. The bed, vast and draped in silk, swallowed her small frame. The in-suite bathroom was larger than her entire previous apartment, with onyx countertops and a shower that could comfortably fit 5. Yet, despite the undeniable comfort, the constant hum of the state-of-the-art climate control, she felt a perpetual chill. The golden chains were invisible, but their weight was undeniable, pressing down on her spirit. She still performed the Golden Serpent, the familiar stage a strange anchor in her appended reality. But everything had changed. The desperate edge that had driven her bow was gone, replaced by a peculiar, almost disorienting sense of security. Damon Volkov's presence, though rarely seen, was everywhere. Her new schedule, delivered by a silent aide named Sergei, was meticulously organized. Her meals, chosen from a private chef's rotating menu, appeared as if by magic. And always, the subtle, watchful eyes of Volkov's men were a periphery blur, guardians in black suits, ensuring no one, no Silas, dared approach her. One afternoon, a large, heavy case arrived. It was too elegant for her Guarneri. Inside, nestled on crimson velvet, lay a violin. Not just any violin, but a contemporary masterpiece crafted by a renowned Italian luthier, its wood glowing with a warm amber sheen. It was flawless, perfectly balanced, exuding an almost sentient beauty. A note, brief and devoid of sentiment, lay tucked beneath the bow, "For your new life, DV." Alara stared at it, a complex swirl of emotions churning within her. Gratitude warred with resentment. He hadn't asked if she wanted a new violin. He had simply provided a possessive gesture that simultaneously replaced her loss and underscored his absolute control. He owned her debt, her safety, and now even her instrument. It was a golden shackle, perfectly forged. When she played it for the first time, its voice was rich, vibrant, untainted by the ghosts of her past. Yet, as the glorious sound filled the penthouse, a part of her mourned the familiar, scarred voice of her Guarneri, still safely stored away, a reminder of her former desperate self. Their interactions remained brief, formal, yet charged with a subtle undercurrent of unspoken questions. Damon would sometimes appear in the lounge during her sets, his presence a dark, powerful magnet in the shimmering room. His cold steel eyes would meet hers across the distance, a silent acknowledgement of their bizarre arrangement. He never applauded, never lingered, but the sheer force of his attention was enough. She felt it, a constant, almost physical pull. Dinner was often taken separately, in their respective corners of the sprawling penthouse. But occasionally, she would find him in the vast, minimalist dining room, a single plate set opposite his. The meals were exquisite, silent affairs, punctuated only by the delicate clinking of silver against porcelain. During one such dinner, as she meticulously cut a piece of perfectly seared fish, Damon broke the silence. "Your interpretation of Paganini last night." His voice was a low hum, a surprising departure from his usual terse commands. It was fierce, almost defiant. Alara's fork paused midway to her mouth. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Paganini demands defiance, she replied, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. He was a rule breaker. A flicker, a ghost of a smile, touched the corner of his lips. Indeed. He took a slow sip of his rich red wine, his eyes never leaving hers. A quality I appreciate. The implication hung in the air, a silken thread of understanding. He saw her defiance, acknowledged it, perhaps even valued it. This was not the interaction of a master and his possession, but of two formidable wills sensing something akin to recognition. It was unnerving, a small crack in the impenetrable facade he presented to the world. Other times, she would catch glimpses of him late at night, in the cavernous study filled with leather-bound books and the faint aroma of aged whiskey. He'd be on the phone, his voice a low, commanding murmur, his profile stark against the city lights. She'd observe the tension in his shoulders, the fleeting shadow that crossed his face, hints of the immense, dangerous weight he carried. He was not just a rich man. He was a king, constantly guarding his throne. One evening, passing the study, she heard a soft, melancholic melody played on a piano. It was a familiar classical piece, something steeped in longing. She paused, invisible in the shadow of a towering marble column. Damon was at the grand piano in the corner, his large, powerful hands moving with a surprising, almost delicate grace over the keys. He played with a raw, unexpected emotion that completely contradicted his cold exterior. The music filled the silent penthouse, a whisper of a hidden soul. When he finished, he simply sat there, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, before rising abruptly and walking away, leaving the lingering notes to fade into the vast silence. Alara's heart ached with a strange, unfamiliar pang. He was more than he seemed. Far more. The air between them grew thick with unspoken things. Their eyes would meet across a room, holding for a fraction of a second too long. A brush of hands when he unexpectedly held open a door. A shared, almost imperceptible sigh after a particularly chaotic casino night. Her resentment slowly began to intertwine with a dangerous curiosity, a reluctant admiration for his ruthless efficiency, and a burgeoning, undeniable attraction. He was her captor, her protector, and in the terrifying solitude of the penthouse, he was becoming something else entirely. Something magnetic. Something irresistible. One night, after her performance, she found him waiting by the elevator, a rare occurrence. His gaze, usually so detached, seemed to burn with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak, just nodded, gesturing for her to enter. As the doors closed, sealing them into the intimate silence of the ascent, his hand reached out, not quite touching her, but hovering inches from her arm. The air thrummed with unspoken electricity, a silent language passing between them. Alara's breath hitched, her senses alive to the masculine sin of him, the sheer proximity of his coiled power. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a silent promise and a dangerous threat. She was no longer just a bird in a golden cage. She was a moth drawn inexorably to a mesmerizing, deadly flame. And as the elevator chimed, signaling their arrival at the penthouse, Alara knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the whispers in the opulent rooms were slowly, irrevocably, turning into an intoxicating hum of desire. The night Alara saw Julian again, the casino air seemed to thicken, suddenly heavy with the ghosts of her past. She was performing a lively Vivaldi concerto, her new Guarneri, a gift from Damon, singing with a clarity and richness that thrilled her. Her fingers, unburdened by debt, danced with a newfound freedom. A subtle ease had begun to settle into her routine, a fragile peace under Damon's unwavering, though often unseen, protection. But that peace shattered into 1,000 glittering shards when she spotted him. Julian Thorne. He stood near the bar, a little older, a little more haggard, the boyish charm now wearing thin, revealing the desperate predator beneath. His expensive suit was slightly rumpled, his smile a shade too wide, too eager. The sight of him sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated revulsion through Alara, like a noxious poison surging through her veins. Her bow faltered, a single discordant note jarring her composition, a small echo of her previous, devastating public mistake. She forced herself back into the music, but her eyes, despite her efforts, kept darting back to him. He was looking at her, his gaze possessive, calculating. As her set ended, he began to move, pushing through the throng of patrons with an obnoxious confidence. His eyes were fixed on her, that familiar, predatory glint making her stomach churn. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a desperate bird trapped in a tightening snare. She felt the immediate, instinctive urge to flee, to somehow vanish into the opulent wallpaper. Alara, my darling! Julian's voice, though artificially jovial, was like nails on a chalkboard. He reached her just as she was packing away her violin, his hand reaching for her arm. She recoiled, pulling away as if burned. The scent of cheap cologne and desperation clung to him, a stark contrast to the clean, dangerous aroma that usually accompanied Damon's silent presence. Julian, she managed, her voice a thin thread of ice. What are you doing here? What? Can't a man admire his ex-wife's talent? He leaned in conspiratorially, his eyes darting around the lounge, not quite meeting hers. Look, I'm in a bit of a bind. Just a small venture, a real gold mine, actually. But I need a little capital. You're doing well, aren't you? Playing for the big leagues now. His gaze lingered on the new Guarneri case, then swept over her simple, elegant dress. Volkov's woman, fancy. His words, implying she was a kept woman, were a public humiliation. Her cheeks flushed with anger, but beneath it, a cold fear twisted in her gut. He wanted money. He always wanted money. And he clearly had no idea whose territory he was trespassing on. I have nothing for you, Julian, she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. Get out. He scoffed, his eyes hardening. Come on, Alara. We had something. Don't tell me you've forgotten all those nights. I just need a little boost, bridge loan. And maybe we could work together again. Think of the old times. His words dripped with a slimy insinuation that made her skin crawl. It was then that she felt a shift in the atmosphere. A subtle, almost imperceptible dip in the surrounding chatter. Her gaze, drawn instinctively, found Damon Volkov. He was seated at his usual table, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand, his eyes fixed on their interaction. His posture was relaxed, almost languid, yet he radiated an icy stillness that spoke of immense coiled power. He didn't move, didn't react overtly, but Alara felt the weight of his attention, a silent, deadly warning. He had seen. He had heard. Julian, oblivious to the dangerous undercurrents, pressed on. Come on, Alara. Just dinner. For old time's sake. We can talk about how you can help me with my new business venture. He grinned, a flash of white, predatory teeth. Suddenly, a massive hand clamped down on Julian's shoulder. Sergei, Damon's silent aide, had materialized from the shadows, his presence a dark, immovable force. Julian yelped, spinning around, his face paling as he met Sergei's impassive stare. Mr. Volkov requests your presence at his table, Mr. Thorne. Sergei's voice was a low growl, devoid of any warmth. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Julian's bravado crumbled. He looked from Sergei's immovable bulk to Damon's distant, unreadable face, and a flicker of genuine fear finally touched his eyes. No, that's quite all right. I was just leaving. Now, the single word from Sergei was a hammer blow. Julian, defeated, was escorted, almost dragged, towards Damon's table. Alara watched, a knot of dread and a perverse satisfaction twisting in her stomach. What would Damon do? She didn't have to wait long. That evening, as she dined alone in the penthouse, a message arrived from Sergei. Mr. Volkov invites you to join him for dinner. Her heart thumped. She knew what this meant. She found Damon in the grand dining room, seated at the head of the impossibly long table. The air was thick with expectation. Across from him, a single empty chair awaited her. There was no Julian. Alara, Damon greeted her, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the chair. Join me. She sat, her senses heightened. The exquisite meal, prepared by his private chef, lay before them. The aroma of roasted lamb, thyme, and garlic was intoxicating, but Alara could barely taste it. She was too aware of Damon, his presence, the unspoken question in his steel-gray eyes. Julian Thorne, he finally said, his voice flat, emotionless. He attempted to extort funds from you and propositioned collaboration. Alara swallowed hard. Yes, he's always like that. Damon took a slow sip of his wine. He made demands. He attempted to leverage your past. And he publicly disrespected you under my roof. His voice was low, but each word was laced with a chilling finality. Such insolence cannot be tolerated. He said no more. Alara watched him, a strange cocktail of fear and fierce gratitude swirling inside her. She understood. Damon hadn't needed to tell her what he did. His silence, the calm in his eyes, the undeniable authority that now permeated the very air of the penthouse, was all the answer she needed. Julian Thorne had vanished, not just from the casino, but from the world that mattered to Damon Volkov. A dark, visceral thrill shot through Alara. It was terrifying, this realization of Damon's absolute power, his readiness to eliminate any threat, any perceived insult, without a trace. This was the man who had bought her, who owned her. Yet, paradoxically, a wave of profound relief washed over her. Julian was gone. The constant threat, the sickening reminder of her past, had been brutally, effectively removed. Damon hadn't just protected her, he had cleansed her world. Her gaze met his across the candlelight, complex blend of horror, awe, and a dangerous, burgeoning attraction. He was a monster, yes, a wolf, but he was her wolf. And for the first time, Alara realized, with a chilling certainty, that the idea of being truly and utterly protected by such a man, even at the cost of her freedom, was becoming disturbingly, exhilaratingly alluring. The silent understanding passed between them, a dark, unbreakable bond forged in the quiet elimination of a shared enemy. She was Damon Volkov's, and now Julian Thorne was merely a memory, a broken echo in the opulent silence of Monte Carlo. But what had happened if another threat, one even Damon couldn't silence, dared to surface? Days bled into weeks within the magnificent cage of the penthouse. The echoes of Julian's swift, brutal disappearance still reverberated in Alara's mind, a stark reminder of Damon Volkov's absolute, terrifying power. Yet, paradoxically, a strange sense of calm had settled. The anxiety that had been her constant companion for years had receded, replaced by a peculiar, almost disorienting quiet. She was safe. Undeniably, utterly safe. The price, she reminded herself daily, was her freedom, her autonomy, her very self. But even that self was undergoing a subtle, profound transformation. She spent her mornings practicing, the new Guarneri's voice filling the vast living spaces, rich and pure. In the afternoons, she explored, drawn by a restless curiosity, venturing into the various wings of the penthouse. One particular evening, a restless wind howled outside, rattling the panoramic windows, and the usual hum of the city felt muted, distant. Damon was nowhere to be seen, likely immersed in the dark machinations of his empire. Alara, unable to sleep, found herself drawn to a door she rarely noticed, tucked away off a quiet corridor near the study. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm, golden light spilling onto the marble. The scent wafted out, not the usual sandalwood and leather, but something softer, older. Pine and a faint, sweet hint of dried flowers. Curiosity, a powerful current in her usually guarded heart, pulled her in. The room was unlike any other in the penthouse. Smaller, cozier, it felt like a secret tucked away from the world. Bookshelves lined every wall, crammed with volumes, many of them well-worn and dog-eared. A comfortable armchair, upholstered in deep forest green velvet, sat by a small, unlit fireplace. On the mantelpiece, amidst a scattering of framed photographs, stood a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a lark with outstretched wings. Its simplicity stood out amidst the penthouse's grandeur, a poignant anomaly. Alara stepped closer, her soft slippers making no sound. One photograph in particular caught her eye. It was an old, faded picture, depicting a stern-faced man with eyes eerily similar to Damon's, standing beside a woman whose smile was gentle, almost shy. And between them a boy, perhaps 7 or 8, clutching a miniature violin. His face, though young, held a familiar intensity, a spark she now recognized. Damon. His childhood. A life before the tailored suits and the steel gaze. As she reached out a tentative finger to trace the boy's image, a voice sharp and low cut through the quiet. Lost, Alara? She jumped, her hand recoiling as if burned. Damon stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. He wasn't in his usual impeccable suit, but a dark, unbuttoned silk shirt that exposed a glimpse of hard, muscled chest. His hair was slightly disheveled, his eyes dark, guarded. He looked vulnerable, and that made her even more uneasy. I apologize, she stammered, her cheeks flushing. The door was open. I didn't mean to intrude. He stepped fully into the room, his gaze sweeping over her, then settling on the photograph in her hand. A fleeting shadow, raw and profound, crossed his face before his usual mask of impassivity slammed back into place. My mother, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. And my father. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, and my brother, Nikolai. Alara looked back at the picture. There was a second boy, older, his arms slung casually around young Damon. She hadn't noticed him before, overshadowed by Damon's intensity. Your brother, she asked, her voice hushed. He passed away, Damon stated, his voice now flat, devoid of emotion, yet the very flatness spoke volumes. When I was 17. An accident. His eyes were fixed on the photograph, seeing something she couldn't. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken grief, a silent scream of loss. Alara felt a pang of profound empathy. She knew what it was to lose, to be left with the wreckage of a life. His seemingly impenetrable armor had a crack, a deep, jagged scar she could suddenly almost feel. He wasn't just a powerful, ruthless king. He was a man who had known devastating sorrow. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice genuine. She understood then why this room felt different. It was his sanctuary, a repository of memories, a place where the king could be just a man. Damon tore his gaze from the photo, looking at her, a flicker of surprise in his steel eyes. He didn't expect pity. He certainly didn't expect empathy. He took the photograph from her, placing it carefully back on the mantelpiece, his fingers brushing the wooden lark. This bird, he said, his voice almost a murmur. Nikolai carved it for my mother. Before he left, he sat down in the armchair, sinking into its plush depths, his usual rigid posture softening. Alara, hesitant, took a seat on a small ottoman opposite him. The wind still howled faintly outside, but in this room, a different kind of quiet settled, intimate and fragile. You play, he said, shifting the topic, but not entirely. Because it is who you are. Because it connects you to something beautiful. Yes, she admitted, her gaze on the wooden lark. And you. What connects you to this? She gestured vaguely around the room, around the penthouse, around the vast, dangerous empire he commanded. He was silent for a long moment, swirling a glass of amber liquid that had appeared on a nearby table. Duty, he finally said, his voice heavy. Legacy. And to protect what remains. His eyes met hers, a depth of weariness in them that startled her. I watched my father destroy himself, trying to hold it all together after Nikolai. I vowed I wouldn't make the same mistakes. He told her in clipped, precise sentences about the brutal world he'd been born into, the expectations, the constant threats, the weight of responsibility he'd carried since adolescence. He spoke of the loneliness, the isolation, the calculated ruthlessness required to survive, to lead. He didn't ask for sympathy, simply laid out the stark, brutal facts of his existence. And in return, Alara found herself sharing. Not just the surface pain of Julian's betrayal, but the deeper wounds. The shame of being manipulated, the crushing disappointment of lost dreams, the fear that she would never reclaim her own identity. She spoke of the vulnerability she felt as an artist, pouring her soul into every note, only to have it twisted and exploited. I feel like I lost myself, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. Like I traded pieces of who I was for survival. Until there was nothing left but music, and even that was almost taken. Damon listened, his gaze unwavering, but softer now, less analytical, more understanding. When she finished, he simply reached out, his large hand covering hers where it rested on the ottoman. His touch was warm, unexpectedly gentle, yet firm, possessive. It wasn't a sexual touch, but one of deep, profound connection. "You didn't lose yourself, Alara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly comfort. "You merely learned to fight for it. And now you fight with my protection." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a small, intimate gesture that sent a surprising shiver through her. "We are not so different, you and I. Both burdened by pasts we didn't choose. Both fighting to protect what we hold dear." The air between them crackled with a new intimacy, a fragile bridge built over the chasm of their vastly different worlds. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the dangerous mafia boss, but the man beneath the armor, scarred, burdened, fiercely protective. And in that moment, Alara realized that the golden chains felt less like a prison and more like a shared, dangerous destiny. She was not just his possession. She was his confidant, his unexpected ally in a world that offered no quarter. But as the night deepened and the unexpected closeness lingered, a chilling thought emerged. What had happened if the fragile trust they were building was put to the ultimate test? What if a threat arose that demanded more than just Damon's ruthlessness? A threat that struck at the very heart of this newfound, terrifying connection. The fragile peace Alara had cultivated in the opulent confines of the penthouse, nurtured by Damon's unexpected vulnerability and their shared secrets, shattered with brutal suddenness. A storm brewed in the Monte Carlo skies, mirroring the tempest that was about to engulf her. She had just finished a particularly moving rendition of Brooks' violin concerto at the Golden Serpent, her fingers still tingling from the performance. The applause, warm and genuine, had filled her with a quiet triumph. She had seen Damon earlier that evening, a fleeting glimpse of his imposing figure at a discreet table, his eyes, as always, finding hers across the glittering expanse of the lounge. A small, almost imperceptible nod from him had sent a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling dangerously close to contentment. Tonight, however, her usual security detail, a silent but ever-present shadow, seemed slightly lax. Perhaps Damon was preoccupied with an empire matter, or perhaps Silas, the venomous lone shark she thought was a ghost of the past, had simply grown bolder, more desperate. The night air was thick with a promise of rain, a heavy, humid blanket that clung to her skin as she exited the service entrance, hurrying towards the waiting car. The usual roar of the city felt muffled, distant, replaced by the insistent whisper of the rising wind. A sudden, sharp tug on her arm. A hand, rough and smelling faintly of stale tobacco, clamped over her mouth, muffling her startled gasp. Panic, cold and instant, flared through her veins. Her violin case, clutched tightly in her left hand, was wrenched away, the sound of it clattering onto the pavement a sickening punctuation to her terror. She fought, instinct kicking in, struggling against the iron grip, her heels scrabbling uselessly on the damp asphalt. The scent of chloroform, sickly sweet and cloying, pressed against her nostrils. Her vision blurred, the kaleidoscope of Monte Carlo's lights spinning into an indistinct haze. Despair, sharp and absolute, pierced through the rapidly numbing fog in her brain. Damon. Her last conscious thought was a desperate plea for the man who had claimed her. Then, darkness. The message arrived on Damon Volkov's secure comms device, a jarring buzz in the otherwise serene silence of his study. He was reviewing a complex financial report, the numbers a familiar language of power and control. His mind, usually a fortress of logic, was preoccupied by an unfamiliar warmth, a fleeting image of Alara on stage, her face alight with passion, her music a balm he hadn't known he needed. Julian's pathetic, whinging attempt at a comeback had been dealt with swiftly, cleanly. Alara was safe. She was his. The screen flashed with an anonymous, encrypted sender. Damon's jaw tightened. He recognized the signature digital fingerprint, crude and desperate, Silas. He opened the message, his fingers stilling on the cold metal of the device. It was a video. Grainy, poorly lit, but sickeningly clear. Alara, her face pale, eyes wide with terror, gagged and bound, slumped against a grimy wall. Her beloved Guarneri lay on the floor beside her, its pristine wood marred by a dark, ominous stain. The sight was like a physical blow, a visceral punch to his gut that stole his breath. A distorted voice, clearly Silas, crackled over the video. Volkov, you thought you could take what's mine, didn't you? Humiliate me? Break my business. The voice escalated into a manic cackle. This one was mine first. Her debt, her soul. You just took on a damaged goods, didn't you? Now she's back where she belongs. And you, mighty Volkov, you pay the price for insolence. The terms were laid out, a ludicrous sum of money, an impossible public apology broadcast across his casino's network, and a concession of a significant portion of his territory. Do this, Silas snarled, or your precious violinist gets a one-way ticket to the bottom of the Mediterranean. And everyone will know you, Damon Volkov, lost your price. Weakness. That's what they'll see. Weakness. Damon's hand clenched around the comms device, the plastic groaning under the pressure. Fury, cold and absolute, erupted within him, a volcanic rage that threatened to consume everything in its path. How dared this gutter rat, this pathetic worm, challenge him? How dared he touch what was his? But beneath the blinding rage, a colder, more insidious emotion began to fester. Suspicion. Silas was cunning, yes, but this level of daring, it was almost too brazen. Had Julian, in his pathetic attempt at revenge, somehow orchestrated this from the shadows? Or worse? His mind replayed every interaction with Alara, every shared glance, every soft confession in the quiet of the penthouse. He remembered her desperation, her past entanglement with Silas. A dark, ugly doubt, like a venomous serpent, began to coil around his heart. Had she played him? Had she, perhaps, used him to escape Silas, only to return to her old ties when the pressure mounted? The thought was a searing brand, a betrayal so profound it threatened to unravel the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He allowed himself to feel something, to trust a fragile connection. And now, that connection was potentially a poison dagger aimed directly at his pride, his empire, his very reputation. The anger warred with a crushing despair. The image of her terrified face, the desperate plea in her eyes, flickered before him. He had sworn to protect her. He had claimed her. And now she was in the hands of a monster, perhaps by her own doing, or perhaps because he had been blind. The thought of losing her, truly losing her, sent a cold spike of fear through him that he rarely experienced. It wasn't just about his reputation, not just about his power. It was about her. Her music. Her defiance. The unexpected light she had brought into his dark, isolated world. A primal scream tore through him, silent but visceral. His hand slammed down on the heavy mahogany desk, the wood groaning. No. Regardless of how this happened, regardless of whether she was a willing participant or a desperate pawn, she was his. And no one took what belonged to Damon Volkov. He stood, his eyes blazing, a cold, ruthless fire burning within them. The rage was a focused weapon, honing his every instinct. He would find her. He would tear Monte Carlo apart, piece by piece, stone by stone, until she was back under his protection. And then Silas would pay. Julian, if he was involved, would pay. And Alara would face him. The truth, whatever it was, would be dragged into the light. And the consequences for deception, for betrayal, in his world, were always absolute. Damon stalked towards the comms, his every muscle taut with lethal intent. His voice, when he finally spoke into the receiver to his head of security, was a low, dangerous growl that promised oblivion. Find her. Every man, every resource. Tear this city apart. I want Alara Vance back, and I want Silas brought to me. Alive, but barely. His eyes, cold and merciless, stared out at the glittering, unsuspecting city. The game had just turned deadly, and Damon Volkov was about to show Monte Carlo why he was feared, why he was truly the Serpent King. The red glow of the secure comms device bathed Damon's face in an infernal light, reflecting the hellfire blazing in his steel eyes. Silas's grotesque message, the video of Alara's terrified face, looped endlessly in his mind, a corrosive acid eating at his control. Fury, cold and absolute, erupted within him, a cataclysmic force that threatened to level his meticulously constructed world. How dared Silas? How dared this pathetic, sniveling worm touch his? The possessiveness, raw and primal, surged through him, eclipsing all other emotions. He had claimed her, sheltered her, given her a new life, however gilded the cage. To have her ripped away, to have her vulnerability exploited, to see her terror, it was an unforgivable sacrilege. His voice, when it tore through the comms, was a low, dangerous growl that promised oblivion. Sergei, every man, every resource, tear Monte Carlo apart. I want her back, and I want Silas brought to me. Alive, but barely. The command rippled through his network like a shockwave. The vast, intricate machinery of the Volkov Empire, usually operating with a silent, almost invisible efficiency, roared to life. From the opulent casinos to the shadowy docks, from the high-rise offices to the hidden warehouses, every asset, every loyal soldier was mobilized. Vehicles, sleek black ghosts, tore through the Monte Carlo streets, their engines a furious whisper. Calls were made, information exchanged in clipped, urgent tones. Fear, a potent currency, spread through the city's underworld. Everyone knew, when Damon Volkov unleashed his fury, the consequences were devastating. Damon didn't sit still. He paced the length of his penthouse study, a caged predator, his mind a whirlwind of strategic calculations and raw, brutal intent. The elegant space, usually a sanctuary of controlled power, now felt too small, too quiet for the tempest raging within him. The doubt, the insidious suspicion that Alara might have played a part in her own capture, still gnawed at him, a festering wound beneath his rage. But it was a secondary concern. The immediate, overwhelming imperative was to retrieve her, to hold her, to ensure she was safe under his protection. Only then could he unravel the truth. Only then could he deal with the unbearable sting of potential betrayal. Hours blurred into a relentless, agonizing hunt. Sergei's updates, usually precise and reassuring, were clipped, fraught with the urgency of the search. Warehouse districts, docks, old tunnels, were shaking every tree, boss. Meanwhile, Alara's world had shrunk to a small, putrid cell. The air was thick with the stench of damp concrete, stale fear, and something vaguely metallic. Her head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against her temples. The ropes binding her wrists and ankles were rough, chafing her skin raw. Her mouth was dry, her throat aching from a scream she couldn't remember uttering. She whimpered, a small, pathetic sound lost in the oppressive silence. Silas had been here. He'd gloated, his face a sneering mask of triumph, his breath foul with cheap liquor. He talked about Damon, about retribution, about making Volkov pay. Alara had tried to speak, to beg, but the gag had been tight, suffocating. Her violin. She'd seen it. Lying on the floor of the room where she'd been dragged, its dark wood scarred, a deep, ugly gouge across its body. The violation had been almost as painful as her own capture. Tears, hot and silent, had streamed down her face, a torrent of despair. She was trapped again, a pawn in a game far more brutal than she could have ever imagined. Hope, a fragile flame, dwindled with each passing second. Would Damon even look for her? Would he care? Or would he simply write her off as a liability? The thought was a chilling, absolute despair. Finally, an encrypted ping cut through the tension in Damon's study. A location. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the old industrial port, notorious for its labyrinthine tunnels and forgotten docks. Silas's arrogance was matched only by his foolishness. Damon moved, not with haste, but with a terrifying, controlled speed. He donned a tactical vest, the familiar weight of comfort. A sleek, silenced pistol was holstered at his hip. Sergei was already in the armored SUV, grim-faced, his eyes alight with the same cold ferocity. The convoy, a sleek phalanx of black vehicles, sliced through the night. Damon sat in the back, his gaze fixed on the grim landscape flashing past the window, his mind already mapping out the assault. Every detail, every contingency ran through his thoughts. But beneath the strategic calculations, a singular image persisted, Alara's terrified eyes. He would tear the world apart to find her. The warehouse was a skeletal monument to decay, its corrugated iron walls rusting, its windows shattered like empty eyesores. The air was thick with a metallic tang of salt and decay. Volkov's men, a silent, lethal force, fanned out, surrounding the perimeter. Damon led the breach, a dark, avenging angel, his movements fluid and deadly. The initial assault was swift, brutal. Shouts, the muffled crack of silenced gunfire, the sickening thud of bodies hitting concrete. Damon moved through the labyrinthine corridors, his senses hyper-alert. The stench of stale blood and fear grew stronger. He found Silas in a cramped, cluttered office, surrounded by two of his remaining thugs. Alara was there, slumped in a chair, her bonds visible, her hair disheveled, a bruise blooming on her cheek. Her guarneri, its broken body a poignant testament to Silas's cruelty, lay in pieces at her feet. A guttural roar tore from Damon's throat, raw and unrestrained. He was a force of nature, a tempest of vengeance. His men engaged Silas's thugs, a flurry of precise, lethal movements. Damon, however, had eyes only for Silas. "You piece of filth," Damon growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the decaying space. You dared to touch what is mine." Silas, emboldened by a desperate cocktail of adrenaline and foolishness, fumbled for a knife on his desk, his face contorted in a sneer. "She was never yours, Volkov. She was just a debt, a whore you bought. And now I'll take her apart, piece by piece, just like that worthless violin." The words, the image of Alara's broken instrument, sent Damon's rage spiraling into a chilling, absolute frenzy. He moved, not with the calculated precision of a trained assassin, but with the raw, untamed savagery of a cornered beast. Silas barely had time to register the blur of motion before Damon was on him, his large hand clamping around Silas's wrist, twisting, a sickening crack echoing in the small room. The knife clattered to the floor. Damon's other hand, a steel vice, gripped Silas by the throat, lifting him clear off his feet. Silas gasped, his eyes bulging, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. Damon's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his eyes burning with a terrifying, possessive fire. "She is mine." Damon enunciated each word slowly, deliberately, his voice a venomous whisper that promised agonizing death. "Every breath, every note, every beat of her heart. You took what was mine, and for that you will pay." He slammed Silas against the grimy wall. Then again, a brutal, bone-jarring impact. Alara, watching through a haze of fear and dawning comprehension, whimpered. Her eyes, wide and terrified, met Damon's. There was no mistaking the savage beauty of his rage, the undeniable, overwhelming power he wielded. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster. And in that terrifying, brutal moment, a flicker of profound relief, cold and sweet, washed over her. He had come. He had actually come for her. Damon let Silas drop, a broken, wheezing heap on the floor. He didn't spare him another glance. His gaze, now softening with a chilling intensity, swept over Alara. He was at her side in an instant, his powerful hands untying the rough ropes with surprising gentleness, his fingers brushing her bruised skin. "Alara," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, his gaze locked on the bruise on her cheek. "Did he hurt you?" The possessiveness in his tone was a palpable thing, a declaration more potent than any vow. She shook her head, tears finally escaping, rolling down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "My violin," she choked out, gesturing weakly towards the shattered pieces on the floor. Damon followed her gaze, his jaw tightening, his eyes hardening with renewed, murderous intent. But his focus was already shifting, a priority carved in stone. He pulled her up gently, supporting her trembling weight, his arm a steel band around her waist. Her body, weak and aching, sagged against him, finding an immediate primal comfort in his strength. "I will get you 100 more violins, Alara," he promised, his voice a low, possessive rumble against her ear. 1,000. "But no one touches what is mine." He held her close, his eyes scanning the warehouse, assessing the damage, the aftermath. His men had secured the area. Silas's thugs were neutralized. But Silas himself, battered and broken, lay still conscious, his eyes flickering with a desperate, venomous hatred. Damon's gaze settled on him, cold and merciless. The immediate crisis was over. Alara was safe. But the price of this safety, the brutal retribution that was about to be exacted, had only just begun. And Alara, trembling in the arms of the man who owned her, knew with chilling certainty that the dark, beautiful storm of Damon Volkov's fury had brought her back from the abyss, but had also irrevocably chained her to his dangerous, compelling world. The next chapter, she realized, would be written in blood and unwavering devotion. The journey from the decaying warehouse back to the gleaming pinnacle of the penthouse felt like traversing a chasm between two starkly different realities. One moment, Alara was shivering in the putrid stench of fear and rust. The next, she was enveloped in the cool, silent luxury of Damon's armored SUV. His arm remained a steel band around her, holding her close against his powerful frame. The scent of him, clean, dangerous, and now tinged with a metallic tang of fresh blood, was both terrifying and utterly, irrevocably comforting. She leaned into him, her body trembling uncontrollably, the residual shock making her teeth chatter. "Are you hurt?" His voice, usually a low rumble, was rough with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, a tight rein over a barely contained inferno. He ran a gentle, exploring hand over her bruised cheek, his thumb brushing the tender skin. Alara shook her head, tears still streaming. "My head, my violin," she choked out, the image of its shattered body a fresh stab of pain. "It will be dealt with," he promised, his tone grim, his eyes burning with an unspoken threat for Silas. He pulled her closer, pressing her face into his shoulder, shielding her from the chaos outside the tinted windows. She heard the low, urgent voices of Sergei and his men, the distant wail of sirens that would never reach their dark, protected world. Upon their arrival at the penthouse, a small, highly efficient medical team, already assembled, moved with quiet urgency. They worked under Damon's watchful, unblinking gaze, their movements precise, deferential. Alara was guided to a lavish guest suite, far from the main living areas, a sanctuary of plush comfort. The warm water of the shower, infused with soothing lavender, cascaded over her skin, washing away the grime and the lingering phantom touch of her captors. She scrubbed until her skin was raw, desperate to erase the memory of the warehouse, of Silas's leering face. Later, wrapped in a silk robe soft as a cloud, she lay in the enormous bed, the scent of fresh linen and expensive moisturizer a stark contrast to the terror she had endured. The doctor, a stern-faced woman with surprisingly gentle hands, had treated her scrapes and bruises, murmuring reassurances. Alara's body ached, a symphony of bruises, but it was the profound exhaustion, the terror etched into her very soul, that weighed her down. Damon returned after the doctor left. He stood in the doorway, a dark, imposing figure, having shed his tactical gear for a fresh, dark suit. His eyes, though still burning with a dangerous intensity, held a newfound, almost paternal concern. He approached the bed, sitting on the edge, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. "Sleep, Alara," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, almost a whisper against the clamor of her traumatized mind. But sleep was a distant country. Every time she closed her eyes, Silas's face materialized, his hands reaching for her, the echo of her violin shattering. She gasped, her eyes flying open, her body jolting upright. Damon was there instantly, his hand on her shoulder, firm and anchoring. "Nightmares?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, tears prickling her eyes. He broke it, Damon. "My violin." He said I was worthless. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His eyes, usually cold steel, flashed with a dark, primal protectiveness. "He will never say anything again, Alara. Not to you. Not to anyone." The certainty in his voice was absolute, chilling. Silas's organization has been dismantled, his assets seized, and Silas himself, he is no longer a concern. His punishment, I assure you, was far more painful than anything he inflicted upon you or your instrument. Alara shivered, a tremor of both fear and a strange, dark satisfaction. She knew what that meant. In Damon's world, justice was brutal, swift, and irreversible. A part of her recoiled from the savagery, from the absolute finality of it. But another deeper, more primal part felt a perverse sense of relief, a profound satisfaction. Julian was gone. Silas was gone. The monsters that had plagued her life had been systematically, ruthlessly eliminated by the man who owned her. He stayed by her side, not speaking, just watching, his presence a silent, immovable anchor in her storm-tossed mind. His hand, warm and strong, held hers. The feeling of his skin against hers, the steady beat of his pulse, was a grounding force. Slowly, painstakingly, the sheer force of his presence began to push back the encroaching shadows. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Why did you come for me like that?" He looked at her then, his steel eyes holding hers, a depth of emotion swirling within them that took her breath away. "You are mine, Alara," he said, his voice a low, possessive rumble, raw and honest. "I claimed you. I swore to protect you. And no one takes what belongs to Damon Volkov." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a gesture of fierce tenderness. "It's not just about power, Alara. It's about loyalty. And something more." The unspoken words hung in the air, electric and fragile. Something more. She felt it too, this tangled, dangerous thread that bound them. She saw him not just as her captor, her protector, but as the man who had laid bare his own scars, who had allowed her to glimpse the vulnerable, burdened soul beneath the formidable exterior. He had descended into hell for her, wielded untold violence, all to bring her back to his golden cage. A profound realization settled within her, warm and terrifying. The initial resentment, the feeling of being trapped, had slowly dissolved, replaced by a deep, unwavering sense of belonging. This man, with his brutal justice and possessive love, had given her something she'd never known: absolute safety, unwavering protection, and a purpose beyond mere survival. She might be his possession, but she was also his confidant, his muse, perhaps even his equal in this strange, dark dance. She lifted her free hand, her fingers brushing his jaw, feeling the slight stubble, the hard planes of his face. His eyes, intense and searching, met hers. "Ah, I belong here," she whispered, the words a quiet revelation. "With you." A breath seemed to catch in his throat. His gaze softened, a flicker of something akin to relief, almost tenderness, touching his hard features. He leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead, a soft, intimate touch that sent shivers through her. "Yes," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You do." He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close, her head resting against his strong chest. In the quiet embrace, amidst the lingering fear and the profound sense of safety, Alara knew. The healing will be long, the scars permanent. But with Damon by her side, a fierce, possessive anchor in her tempestuous world, she would face it all. The cage was still there, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like home. A dangerous, exhilarating home built on loyalty, blood, and a love as dark and undeniable as the Monte Carlo night. And as she finally drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, enveloped in his strength, Alara realized that the battle for her past was over. The battle for her future and her heart had just begun. 3 years. 3 years since Alara Vance had exchanged one form of gilded chains for another, since Damon Volkov's fury had torn through Monte Carlo to claim her. Now, the chains felt less like shackles and more like the strongest, most unbreakable bond she had ever known. Her life, once a symphony of despair and quiet desperation, had blossomed into a complex, thrilling concerto. Tonight, the grand salle of the Opera de Monte Carlo pulsed with an anticipation usually reserved for visiting royalty. Alara, radiant in a midnight blue gown that shimmered under the stage lights, stood before the Monaco Philharmonic Orchestra, her new Guarneri, a gift from Damon, chosen with meticulous care by him, its voice richer and more profound than any she had ever owned, tucked beneath her chin. The hall was packed, a sea of glittering jewels and expectant faces. Her program for the evening was a daring blend, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, a piece that once symbolized her own tempestuous past, followed by a contemporary composition she had co-written, a raw, ethereal melody she called The Serpent's Embrace. As her bow touched the strings, a hush fell over the audience. The first notes of spring bloomed, vibrant and full of renewed life. But as the familiar melody flowed, Alara infused it with a deeper understanding, a newfound strength. Her fingers, no longer trembling with fear, danced with a fierce joy, a passion born not of survival, but of absolute belonging. Every soaring phrase, every delicate trill, was a testament to the journey she had undertaken. She played for the sheer, unadulterated love of it, her music now a powerful dialogue between her soul and the vast, dangerous world she inhabited. From a private box, discreetly shrouded in velvet, Damon Volkov watched her. He was an imposing silhouette against the opulent backdrop, his gaze, as always, fixed solely on her. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the polished wood of his opera glasses, usually a sign of restless impatience during such events, was notably absent. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his lips. Pride, cold and absolute, resonated within him, mirroring the swell of the orchestra. She was his muse, his maestro, and every magnificent note she coaxed from that instrument was a testament to his claim, his protection, his relentless pursuit of her. He remembered the broken girl in a warehouse, the fear in her eyes, the shattered pieces of her old violin. He had promised her new ones 1,000 more. But more importantly, he had given her back her fire, amplified it. He had created this. This woman, radiating strength and sublime artistry, was a direct result of his ownership, his relentless love. The thought sent a jolt of fierce satisfaction through him, a dark primal contentment that few men of his standing ever truly experienced. When Alara finished The Serpent's Embrace, the final, lingering note dying in the air, the silence was profound, almost reverent. Then an explosion. Not of violence, but of ecstatic applause. The entire hall rose, a standing ovation that thundered through the grand salle. Bouquets of roses, lilies, and orchids rained down onto the stage. Alara, flushed with a genuine, unadulterated joy, bowed deeply, her eyes sweeping the adoring crowd. And then, inevitably, her gaze found his. Damon offered no grand gesture, no overt display. He simply raised his glass of champagne, a slow, deliberate tilt, his steel eyes meeting hers, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. Mine. And magnificent. Later that night, the Monte Carlo cityscape glittered like spilled diamonds beneath them, stretching to the dark velvet of the Mediterranean. Alara and Damon stood on the sprawling terrace of the penthouse, the cool night air a welcome balm after the heat of the stage. She had changed into a soft, flowing silk nightgown, her hair unbound, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. The scent of her perfume, a delicate blend of jasmine and amber, mingled with the faint, musky scent of his skin. You were extraordinary, Damon murmured, his voice a low, gravelly current against her ear as he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her flush against his solid warmth. His chin rested on the crown of her head, his breath stirring her hair. "It was for you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her back. Every note, every feeling. He turned her gently in his arms, his large hands cradling her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His eyes, usually so guarded, were soft now, vulnerable in a way only she had ever seen. "I told you, you were mine," he said, his voice a possessive purr. "But you became so much more. You are my world, Elara. My anchor in the chaos." "And you," she replied, her fingers tracing the hard planes of his jaw, "are the tempest that brought me peace, the darkness that showed me light." Her eyes met his, clear and unwavering. "This life, it's not what I imagined, but it's everything I never knew I needed." He kissed her then, a slow, deep, consuming kiss that tasted of wine and triumph and an unspoken, unbreakable promise. It wasn't the courthouse kiss, nor the desperate kiss in the warehouse. This was a kiss of absolute certainty, of two souls irrevocably intertwined, forged in fire and shadow. "No more cages, Elara," he murmured against her lips, his breath warm. "Only shared dominion. Our empire. Our future." She smiled, a soft, radiant smile that melted the last vestiges of her past. "Our empire. And our legacy." Her gaze dropped subtly, meaningfully, to his hand resting gently on her stomach. Damon's eyes, usually so quick to understand, widened imperceptibly. A flicker of surprise, then pure, unadulterated joy, transformed his face, chasing away the last shadows of the ruthless king. He let out a low, disbelieving laugh, a sound she rarely heard, a sound that spoke of a deep, profound happiness. "A legacy," he repeated, his voice husky with emotion. He pulled her even closer, his touch reverent. "A maestro and his muse. And a new symphony, Elara. A new life to conduct." He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, carrying her from the terrace into the soft lamplight of their bedroom, the city lights twinkling behind them, silent witnesses to their unbreakable bond. The gold of Monte Carlo, the darkness of his world, the beauty of her art, all merged into a single, perfect harmony. Elara Vance, the desperate violinist, had been saved by the Mafia Boss, and in return, she had owned him irrevocably, completely, weaving her music into the very fabric of his dangerous, beautiful soul. Their story, born of chaos, had found its most exquisite, enduring melody. Isn't it profound how sometimes the darkest storms bring forth the most breathtaking dawns? Elara's journey reminds us that our worth isn't defined by the debts or betrayals of our past, but by the unwavering strength we find to reclaim our music, our soul. Damon, with his fierce, possessive love, showed us that healing can come in unexpected forms, transforming a gilded cage into an empire of belonging. Every scar tells a story of survival, a testament that you are stronger than you know, more worthy than you believe. If Elara's transformation resonated with the battles you're silently fighting, if this story ignited a spark of hope within your own heart, then you are not alone. Join our community where we celebrate resilience and believe in love that conquers all. Like this video, subscribe for more powerful tales, and tell us in the comments, "I am worthy," because you absolutely are.